The spring morning broke cold over the city of Magdeburg. Master Mason Klaus Reinhardt stood on the eastern wall, his calloused hands gripping the stone he'd spent 20 years building. He pressed a weathered spyglass to his eye and watched the horizon. It wasn't darkening with storm clouds. It was an army. They came across the northern German plain like a slow flood, column after column of soldiers stretching back for miles. Reinhardt's hands remained steady, but his mind was doing the arithmetic that every man learns to fear. 2,000 people inside these walls. 25,000 coming to kill them. 13 to 1. The Imperial Catholic forces under General Pappenheim had arrived, and they'd come to erase Magdeburg from the map. Behind Reinhardt, a young voice broke the silence. It belonged to Peter Meinhof, a university student barely 19 years old, trying hard not to sound terrified. "What do we do?" he asked. Reinhardt lowered the spyglass and turned to face the handful of people standing with him. They weren't soldiers. They were merchants, craftsmen, widows, students, people who'd spent their lives building things, not destroying them. They were looking at him the way drowning men look at a rope. "We hold," Reinhardt said quietly. "We hold until there's nothing left to hold with. Before we go further, let me ask you something. If you appreciate stories like this, real history about real people facing impossible odds, do me a favor. Hit that like button and drop a comment below. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who care about the past. And trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Because what happened at Magdeburg in the spring of 1631 shouldn't have been possible. A city of civilians facing the most powerful military machine in Europe. They had maybe 6 weeks of food if they rationed carefully. 42 cannons, most of them old and unreliable. Walls that hadn't been tested in a real siege for generations. And they had Klaus Reinhardt, a man who'd spent 3 years watching the war creep closer, knowing this day would come. Now it was here. Reinhardt walked along the wall, past people checking their weapons, past women organizing supplies in the courtyard, past children too young to understand what was about to happen. He stopped at the northern tower and looked out at the approaching army. Somewhere in that mass of steel and gunpowder was General Gottfried Heinrich Graf zu Pappenheim, a veteran of a dozen sieges, a man who had never failed to take a city. Reinhardt had read the reports. He knew what Pappenheim did to cities that resisted. He knew about the executions, the burnings, the survivors sold into slavery. He knew, and he stayed anyway. "Send word to every position," Reinhardt said. "All civilians to their assigned stations, all defenders to the walls. No one fires until I give the order." The young student hesitated. "Sir, should we try to negotiate?" Reinhardt looked at him. "There's nothing to negotiate," he said. "They want this city. We won't give it to them. So we're going to teach them what it costs to take something from people who refuse to surrender." The Imperial Army reached the edge of cannon range and stopped. 25,000 men waiting, 2,000 souls refusing to break. The siege was about to begin. To understand what Reinhardt was facing, you need to understand what the 30 Years' War had become by 1631. This wasn't some minor regional conflict. This was a religious war that had been tearing Europe apart for 13 years, and it showed no signs of stopping. The Catholic League, backed by the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, was winning. Protestant cities across Germany had been falling like dominoes. Some surrendered without a fight. Others resisted and were destroyed so completely that their names disappeared from maps. The Edict of Restitution, issued 2 years earlier, had forced Protestant territories to return church lands to Catholic control. It was cultural annihilation disguised as policy. Magdeburg mattered because it was the last major Protestant stronghold in northern Germany. The city sat on the Elbe River, controlling trade routes that connected the Baltic Sea to the heart of Europe. Wealthy merchant families had built it into one of the richest cities in the region. If Magdeburg fell, the road to Denmark and Sweden would be wide open. The Protestant cause would collapse. The city had once held more than 30,000 people. But as the imperial armies advanced through the surrounding territories, most fled north to safer lands. Only 2,000 remained, not because they were particularly brave, but because they had nowhere else to go. These were merchants who'd invested everything in their businesses, craftsmen whose workshops were their entire lives, families who'd lived in Magdeburg for generations and couldn't imagine starting over somewhere else. They stayed because leaving meant losing everything they'd ever built. The enemy they faced was unlike anything most of them had ever seen. General Pappenheim commanded approximately 25,000 troops, 8,000 veteran infantry who'd fought in battles across Bohemia and the Palatinate, 5,000 cavalry in full armor, 12,000 support troops, engineers, and specialists, and 42 siege cannons. Pappenheim had a reputation that preceded him like smoke before fire. He'd participated in the siege of Stralsund, which lasted 11 weeks and ended with the survivors enslaved. He'd overseen the fall of New Brandenburg, where the garrison was massacred after just 6 days of resistance. He had a saying that soldiers repeated in camp: "Better a terrible end than endless terror." What made the imperial forces so effective wasn't just their numbers. It was their system. These were professional soldiers who fought year-round, not feudal levies who went home after harvest. They trained together, moved in coordinated formations, and followed a siege doctrine that had been refined over decades. They didn't rush. They systematically isolated their target, destroyed its defenses through bombardment, then overwhelmed it through coordinated assault. The process had been proven in city after city. Ottoman siege tactics expert Dr. Caroline Finkel would later write that the imperial armies of this period represented the peak of early modern European military organization. They combined firepower, discipline, and logistics in ways that most defenders simply couldn't match. Magdeburg knew what was coming. Refugees from fallen cities had flooded in during the previous months, telling stories of what happened to populations that resisted. The pattern was consistent. Leaders were executed publicly. Property was confiscated. Populations were either forced to convert to Catholicism or exiled. Sometimes entire cities were burned to serve as warnings. The people of Magdeburg understood the stakes on a visceral level. This wasn't an abstract political conflict. It was a fight for survival, for their homes, for their right to exist. General Pappenheim's army had never lost a siege. His troops had never shown mercy to a city that made them fight for it. And they were now surrounding Magdeburg's walls, setting up their siege camp, positioning their cannons. From the walls, Klaus Reinhardt watched them work with the efficiency of men who'd done this many times before. He saw the engineering teams marking positions for artillery. He saw the cavalry patrols cutting off the roads. He saw the future closing in. Klaus Reinhardt was born in 1585 in Magdeburg, the son of a stonemason. His father was a quiet man who believed in two things: God and honest work. He taught his son both. Young Klaus learned to shape stone, to read the grain, to understand how weight and pressure moved through a structure. By the time he was 20, he was better at it than his father. He spent the next 2 decades building Magdeburg. His hands laid stone in the city walls, in guild halls, in churches that reached toward heaven. He married a weaver's daughter named Anna. They had a daughter named Elizabeth who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. Then, in 1625, the plague came. It swept through the crowded streets like invisible fire. Klaus buried his wife in spring. He buried his daughter in summer. By autumn, he was alone in a house that felt too large and too quiet. The city became all he had left. Klaus wasn't a soldier. He'd never fought in his life. But he understood structures, how they stood, how they fell. And as the war crept closer to Magdeburg over the following years, he began to see his city differently. Not as a collection of buildings, but as a fortress that might need defending. Most people didn't share his concern. The city council believed Magdeburg was too important to attack, too wealthy, too well-connected. Surely some diplomatic solution would be found. They were wrong, but by the time they realized it, the imperial armies were already moving north. In early 1631, the city council evacuated to safer territory. The Swedish garrison commander withdrew his troops to defend other positions. The mayor died of winter fever. Magdeburg found itself without leadership. The guild council met in a stone hall that Klaus had helped build 15 years earlier. Merchants and craftsmen argued about what to do. Some advocated immediate surrender, others wanted to negotiate. A few thought they should simply open the gates and hope for mercy. Klaus Reinhardt stood up. He wasn't eloquent. He didn't have the education of the merchants or the Polish of the nobles who'd already fled. But he knew how to speak plainly. "I'm not a general," he said. "I'm a mason. But I know these walls. I know this city. I know every weak point, every strong position, every place where we can make a stand. And I know if we run now, there's nowhere left to run to." The hall went quiet. "If we surrender," Klaus continued, "they'll take everything. Our property, our rights, maybe our lives. If we negotiate, we'll be negotiating from weakness, and they'll still take everything. So I say we fight. Not because we can win, but because we can make them pay for what they take." Someone asked the question everyone was thinking. Who would lead this defense? Klaus looked around the room at faces he'd known for decades. These were his neighbors, his friends, people he'd worked alongside. They were looking at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "I will," he said. The guild council voted. Out of 2,000 people remaining in Magdeburg, nearly all voted to stay and fight. They formed a citizens' defense council. Klaus Reinhardt was appointed overall commander. Anna Kessler, a textile merchant's widow, would organize civilian support. Johann Beck, a former mercenary who now ran a brewery, would provide tactical advice. Peter Meinhof, a university student with a gift for languages and codes, would handle intelligence. They had 4 days before the imperial army arrived. Klaus spent those 4 days preparing for a siege he knew they probably couldn't survive. He reinforced weak points in the walls. He organized stockpiles of food and ammunition. He drilled civilians who'd never held a weapon in their lives. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping in his workshop when exhaustion finally overtook him. On the night before the imperial army arrived, Klaus stood alone on the eastern wall, looking out at the dark plain. He thought about his wife and daughter, buried in the cemetery behind the cathedral. He thought about the city he'd spent his life building, and he made peace with the fact that he'd probably die defending it. The next morning, the horizon turned black with soldiers. General Gottfried Heinrich Graf zu Pappenheim was born in 1594 into minor nobility. He'd been a professional soldier since age 15, and by 1631, he'd spent more of his life at war than at peace. He was methodical, efficient, and had a reputation for ruthlessness that he'd earned honestly. His superiors trusted him to deliver results. His soldiers feared him, which was how he preferred it. Pappenheim commanded 25,000 troops, and he knew how to use every single one. His 8,000 veteran infantry formed the backbone of his force. These were men who'd survived multiple campaigns, who moved in coordinated formations, who didn't break under fire. His 5,000 cavalry were cuirassiers, armored shock troops who could smash through defensive lines. The remaining 12,000 were specialists, engineers who could build siege works in days, sappers who could dig mines under fortress walls, artillery crews who operated the 42 cannons that had destroyed fortifications across Europe. Pappenheim's siege doctrine was simple and proven. First, surround the target and cut off all supply lines. Let the defenders know they're alone, that no help is coming. Psychological isolation breaks morale faster than cannons break walls. Second, bombardment. Position the heavy guns just outside musket range and fire continuously, day and night. The goal isn't immediate destruction, it's exhaustion. Make the defenders understand that resistance is futile, that every hour they hold out just means more suffering. Third, mining. While the cannons fire, send sappers underground. Dig tunnels beneath the walls, pack them with gunpowder, collapse entire sections of fortification. Fourth, assault. Once breaches open, send in the infantry in coordinated waves. Accept casualties in the initial push. Overwhelm the defenders through numbers and discipline. Fifth, occupation or annihilation, depending on how long the city resisted. The system worked because Pappenheim applied it without emotion or mercy. In 1629, he'd helped besiege Stralsund. The city held for 11 weeks before falling. The defenders who survived were sold into slavery. In 1630, New Brandenburg lasted 6 days before surrendering. Pappenheim had the garrison commanders executed as examples. The message was consistent: surrender early and live. Resist and suffer. Pappenheim's army arrived outside Magdeburg in mid-March and immediately began establishing siege works. Engineers marked positions for artillery batteries, infantry dug entrenchments, cavalry patrols cut the roads leading north. Within 2 days, the city was completely surrounded. Pappenheim sent an envoy under a flag of truce. The message was standard procedure: surrender the fortress immediately, and the population would be granted safe passage. Refuse and face total annihilation. Klaus Reinhardt's response came back written on a single piece of paper. Magdeburg was built by its citizens. It will be defended by them. Come and take it. Pappenheim read the message and smiled without humor. He'd expected this. Some cities always had to learn the hard way. He gave the order to begin bombardment. What Pappenheim didn't know, because his intelligence reports were incomplete, was that Magdeburg's garrison consisted almost entirely of civilians. He assumed there were at least several hundred professional soldiers inside those walls, trained men who understood siege warfare. He was wrong. But even if he'd known the truth, it wouldn't have changed his approach. Civilians or soldiers, it didn't matter. The outcome was inevitable. His army had never failed to take a city. Magdeburg would fall. The only question was how long it would take and how many of his own men he'd lose in the process. Pappenheim stood in his command tent that evening, studying maps of the city. His engineers had identified weak points in the walls. His artillery commanders had calculated firing angles. His assault teams were ready. He gave himself 2 weeks. 3 at most. After all, he was a professional soldier with 25,000 troops, siege cannons, and decades of military doctrine. What could a handful of civilians possibly do against that? 4 days wasn't enough time to turn merchants and craftsmen into soldiers. Klaus Reinhardt knew that. But 4 days was all they had, so he used every hour. The city transformed into a single organism, preparing for survival. Anna Kessler took charge of logistics with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing supply chains her entire life. She organized the civilian population into specialized units. Merchants who understood inventory became supply officers. Bakers calculated food rations and managed the granaries. Blacksmiths shifted from making horseshoes to forging weapons and repairing armor. University students worked in the chemistry laboratories, manufacturing gunpowder from recipes in old texts. Women were organized into fire teams. In siege warfare, artillery didn't just destroy walls, it started fires that could consume entire districts. Anna positioned teams throughout the city with water barrels and buckets. They drilled on response times until they could mobilize in under 2 minutes. Other women prepared defensive materials. They boiled water and oil in massive cauldrons that would be carried to the walls when assaults came. Johann Beck, the former mercenary turned brewmaster, handled combat training. He was 55 years old with a limp from an old wound and a blunt way of speaking that left no room for illusions. He didn't pretend he could turn shopkeepers into professional soldiers. Instead, he focused on basics. How to load and fire a matchlock musket without blowing your own hand off. How to hold a pike in formation so you don't accidentally impale the person beside you. How to stay low on the walls when arrows are flying. How to not panic when everything goes to hell. He worked with anyone who could hold a weapon. Men, women, anyone over 15. He didn't have time for debates about who should or shouldn't fight. If the walls were breached, everyone would be fighting anyway. Better to prepare them now. Peter Meinhof, the 19-year-old university student, established an intelligence network. He recruited people with contacts outside the city. Merchants who still had safe conduct passes to travel. Refugees who'd fled imperial-controlled territories and knew how their military operated. He set up observation posts in the tallest towers to watch enemy movements. He created a simple code system for messages in case they needed to communicate without being understood if intercepted. The defensive preparations were equally systematic. Reinhardt walked the walls with his mason's eye, identifying every weakness. Where the mortar was crumbling, where the stone had weathered thin, where an artillery bombardment would likely breach first. At each weak point, he ordered earthwork reinforcements built. Teams of civilians dug out soil and packed it behind the stone walls. Earth absorbed cannon impacts better than stone. It compressed rather than shattered. Stockpiling began immediately. Every household contributed food to central granaries. Grain, preserved meat, anything that would keep. Reinhardt calculated they had enough for 6 weeks if they rationed carefully. Maybe 8 weeks if they got desperate. Gunpowder and shot were stored in the driest cellars. Stones were collected from demolished buildings to use as ammunition when cannonballs ran out. Medical supplies were gathered in a makeshift hospital set up in the cathedral. Margarete Schultz, an apothecary, took charge. She had bandages, basic surgical tools, and some medicines. Not enough, but something. Children were given roles too. The younger ones would carry messages between positions. Older boys would haul ammunition to the walls. They drilled on their routes until they could navigate the city blindfolded. On the 4th day, Reinhardt conducted a final inspection. He walked every section of wall, checked every stockpile, spoke to every unit commander. He saw shopkeepers holding pikes they barely knew how to use. Women practicing bucket brigades, children memorizing emergency procedures. They weren't ready. But they were as ready as they'd ever be. That night, Anna Kessler found Reinhardt in his workshop, staring at tools he hadn't touched in days. "Will it be enough?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "But it'll have to be." The next morning, the Imperial Army arrived. The bombardment started at dawn. Klaus Reinhardt was on the eastern wall when the first cannon fired. He'd heard artillery before, but never like this. The sound wasn't just loud. It was physical. A pressure wave that hit you in the chest and made your teeth vibrate. The stone ball screamed through the air and struck the wall 30 feet from where he stood. The impact sent chunks of masonry flying. Dust erupted in a choking cloud. The wall shuddered beneath his feet, but held. Then the second cannon fired, and the third. Within minutes, all 42 Imperial siege guns were firing in a coordinated bombardment. The noise became continuous, overlapping booms that made conversation impossible. Cannonballs struck the walls in systematic patterns, targeting the same sections repeatedly. This was how you destroyed fortifications. Not through single devastating blows, but through relentless, focused destruction. Reinhardt watched his walls take punishment. Stone cracked, mortar crumbled. Entire blocks were knocked loose and tumbled into the city streets below. But the earthwork reinforcements he'd built were doing their job. The packed soil absorbed impact energy that would have shattered pure stone. The walls were damaged, but not breached. Not yet. The civilian defenders reacted differently to being under artillery fire. Some froze, paralyzed by fear. Others panicked and ran for cover. A few, to Reinhardt's surprise, stayed calm and continued their assigned tasks. Anna Kessler's fire teams mobilized when a cannonball crashed through a warehouse roof and started a blaze. Women formed bucket lines, passing water from wells to the fire. They had it controlled within 20 minutes. In the makeshift hospital, Margareta Schultz treated her first casualties. A man struck by flying stone fragments. A woman who'd been standing too close to the wall when a section collapsed. They were the first of many. The bombardment continued all day and all night, and into the next morning. Pappenheim was sending a message. We have unlimited ammunition. We can do this forever. You cannot. On the second day, the first assault came. Through his spyglass, Reinhardt watched 2,000 Imperial infantry form up outside musket range. They carried scaling ladders, long wooden constructions designed to hook onto battlements. The soldiers moved in organized columns, shields raised against arrow fire. Johann Beck positioned defenders along the eastern wall, the section taking the heaviest bombardment. He'd given explicit orders. Don't fire until they're within 50 yards. Make every shot count. The Imperial troops advanced in silence, except for the rhythmic beat of drums. It was a psychological tactic. The discipline, the coordination, the implied message that these were professional soldiers who'd done this before. When they reached 50 yards, Beck gave the order. The walls erupted with musket fire, a ragged volley that cut down the front ranks of the assault. Men fell, screaming or silent. But the troops behind them kept coming. Stepping over the bodies, they reached the base of the wall and threw up their ladders. Dozens of ladders slammed against the battlement simultaneously. Soldiers began climbing. Reinhardt found himself at the top of one ladder, face to face with an Imperial soldier. The man had a scar across his cheek and eyes that showed no emotion. Reinhardt swung his mason's hammer and caught the soldier in the shoulder. The man grunted, lost his grip, and fell backward. The ladder, swayed but held. All along the wall, civilians were fighting for their lives. A baker from the market district pushed a ladder backward with a pike. Women poured boiling water on soldiers trying to climb through an arrow slit. Peter Meinhof, the slight university student, was helping push a heavy stone off the parapet onto clustered troops below. The assault lasted 3 hours. When Pappenheim finally called retreat, the base of Magdeburg's wall was littered with Imperial dead and wounded. But the city had paid too. 28 defenders killed, 60 wounded. For a garrison of only 2,000, those were catastrophic losses. That night, Reinhardt sat in the rubble and did arithmetic he didn't want to do. At this rate of attrition, they had maybe 3 weeks before there weren't enough defenders left to man the walls. Pappenheim could afford to lose 300 men in an assault. Magdeburg couldn't afford to lose 30. Peter Meinhof wasn't a spy by training. He was a theology student who happened to be good with languages and codes. But the siege had a way of turning people into things they'd never imagined being. 3 days into the bombardment, he realized that information was a weapon they desperately needed. The city was surrounded, isolated, and operating blind. Meinhof started small. He positioned observers in the tallest towers with instructions to watch Imperial camp movements. Who was coming and going? Where supplies were being delivered? Which units were moving to which positions? Patterns started emerging. Then he got lucky. A merchant named Fischer still had a safe conduct pass issued before the siege. The document allowed him to leave the city to conduct business in Imperial-controlled territory. It was probably invalid now, but Meinhof convinced Fischer to try. The Imperial pickets let him through. Fischer traveled to nearby villages, ostensibly buying supplies. In reality, he was listening. Camp followers talked. Merchants who supplied the Imperial army talked. Soldiers in taverns definitely talked. He returned with valuable intelligence. Pappenheim expected Magdeburg to fall within 2 weeks. His officers were frustrated that a city of civilians was holding it all. Supply wagons were arriving regularly, so the Imperial army wasn't under immediate resource pressure. But morale wasn't as solid as it appeared. Many soldiers were conscripts, pressed into service from conquered territories. They didn't particularly want to die attacking a city that kept fighting back. Meinhof presented this information to Klaus Reinhardt and Johann Beck in a basement room that served as their command post. The stone walls were thick enough to muffle the constant artillery fire outside. Beck grasped the implications immediately. "If Pappenheim thinks we're just civilians," he said, "then he's underestimating us. We can use that." Reinhardt agreed. They needed Pappenheim to believe Magdeburg was stronger than it actually was. Make him cautious. Make him waste time on excessive preparation instead of just overwhelming them through numbers. The deception campaign began that night. Small groups of defenders marched past torches in repetitive loops, creating the illusion of troop movements. Someone arriving. Reinforcements that didn't exist. They coordinated their musket fire to create volley patterns that suggested more defenders than they actually had. And they sang. Every night, the entire civilian population gathered in sections of the city and sang Protestant hymns in unison. The sound carried across the valley to the Imperial camp. It was defiance made audible. It said, "We're not beaten. We're not afraid. We're still here." Imperial soldiers heard it from their tents. Some found it inspiring in a perverse way. Others found it unsettling. A few, particularly the conscripts who'd been forced into Catholic service, found it troubling on a deeper level. Meinhof's intelligence network expanded. He recruited more people with reasons to travel. He established dead drops where informants could leave messages. He even managed to turn one of the camp followers, a woman who sold bread to Imperial soldiers, into a source. She reported that officers were starting to question the timeline. The information warfare was working, but it came with risks. Pappenheim's counterintelligence forces captured one of Meinhof's messengers. They tortured him and learned that Magdeburg's garrison was primarily civilians, that no Swedish relief force was actually inside the walls. But the messenger also, under duress, revealed how organized the defense was, how prepared, how determined. When Pappenheim received the report, he had a decision to make. He could order an all-out assault, throw everything at the walls and overwhelm them through sheer numbers. It would work, but the casualties would be significant. Or he could continue the systematic approach: bombardment, mining, gradual destruction. It was slower, but safer for his troops. He chose the systematic approach, which gave Magdeburg time to repair damage, time to rest between assaults, time to survive a few more days. Meinhof's network also discovered something else. Rumors were circulating in imperial camps that Swedish forces under King Gustav Adolf were mobilizing in the north, moving toward Brandenburg, possibly preparing a relief expedition. The rumors were partially true. Swedish forces were indeed mobilizing. But they weren't coming to Magdeburg. Not yet. Political negotiations were still ongoing. Meinhof couldn't control whether Sweden would actually come, but he could make sure Pappenheim believed they might. He carefully leaked information through his sources: false reports of Swedish troop movements, forged documents suggesting coordination between Magdeburg and Swedish command. Anything to make Pappenheim worry about fighting on two fronts. Anna Kessler managed the civilian side of morale maintenance. She ensured food distribution remained fair. She organized evening gatherings where people could share concerns. She visited the wounded daily, a visible reminder that leadership cared. Together, the intelligence operations and morale management bought precious time. Not victory, just time. But time was all they had to trade. Anna Kessler had been a textile merchant's wife, then a widow, and now she was something she'd never imagined: a combat leader. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. One morning, she was organizing fire teams. The next, she was standing on the walls with a pike in her hands. The city had no safe positions anymore. Artillery didn't discriminate. A cannonball that punched through a warehouse wall killed the woman organizing supplies just as dead as it killed the man defending the ramparts. When the assaults came, everyone fought. It stopped being a choice and became simple survival. Anna organized the women of Magdeburg into specialized units. Some managed the fire teams, still critical as bombardment started blazes throughout the city. Others prepared defensive materials. They boiled water and oil in massive cauldrons positioned near the walls. When assaults came, teams of women hauled these cauldrons up stone stairs to the battlements. The boiling liquid became one of their most effective weapons. Imperial soldiers climbing ladders couldn't defend against it. The liquid poured down, causing immediate, agonizing burns. Men fell screaming. Those who survived were often blinded or so badly injured they couldn't continue fighting. It was brutal. It was effective. And it was necessary. Margareta Schultz, the apothecary running the makeshift hospital, shifted between healer and fighter. When attacks came, she'd leave the wounded and grab a musket. After the assault ended, she'd return to treating injuries with supplies that were running dangerously low. She started experimenting with makeshift weapons, incendiary mixtures using materials from her apothecary, clay pots filled with chemicals that would ignite on impact, primitive grenades that defenders could throw from the walls. Some worked, some didn't. She kept trying. In mid-April, Pappenheim launched a major assault on the Western Wall. He committed 15,000 troops simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the defenders through numbers. The section he targeted was defended primarily by women. His officers didn't know that. They expected light resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. The women met the assault with everything they had. Boiling oil poured from the battlements. Stones and debris rained down on soldiers at the base of the walls. When Imperial troops managed to get ladders up, women fought them hand to hand with whatever weapons they could grab. Katharina Brandt, a cooper's wife, led a team that pushed barrels filled with stones off the walls onto clustered troops below. The improvised weapons crashed down with devastating effect. Elizabeth Hoffman, who'd spent her life baking bread, found herself swinging an axe at a soldier who'd reached the top of a ladder. She hit him in the shoulder. He fell. She vomited immediately after, then picked up the axe and returned to her position. The assault lasted 4 hours. When Pappenheim finally called retreat, the western wall still stood. Imperial casualties were estimated at over 150. The defenders lost 19 women killed and more than 30 wounded. That night, Anna Kessler walked through the makeshift hospital. She saw women with burns from handling hot cauldrons, women with arrow wounds, women who'd been struck by falling debris. Some would recover, some wouldn't. She found Margareta Schultz working on a young woman who'd taken an arrow through the shoulder. "Will she live?" Anna asked. Margareta didn't look up from her work. "I don't know. The wound isn't fatal, but infection probably will be. We're out of anything that might prevent it." Anna watched the apothecary work for a moment. "You should rest. So should you." Margaret finally looked up, her face exhausted. "But we won't, will we?" It wasn't a question. The women of Magdeburg had crossed a threshold. They'd killed enemy soldiers. They'd seen friends die beside them. They'd learned that survival required becoming something harder than they'd ever thought possible. Some wrestled with the moral weight of it. Others didn't have the luxury. The next assault would come whether they were ready or not. Pappenheim's officers reported back that the women fought like demons. He issued orders that female combatants would be shown no quarter if captured. To demonstrate this, Imperial forces hanged 3 women they'd captured during a failed sortie. The executions were visible from the walls. The effect wasn't what Pappenheim intended. It didn't break morale, it hardened it. The women of Magdeburg understood perfectly. There was no surrendering, no mercy if captured. The only choice was to fight or die. Most chose to fight. Late April brought a new nightmare. Johann Beck had been expecting it, dreading it, preparing for it. The bombardment was brutal, but mining was worse. Underground warfare was psychological torture wrapped in physical danger. Pappenheim's engineers started digging tunnels toward the city walls. The technique was centuries old. You dug from a position outside musket range, shoring up the tunnel with wooden beams as you advanced. Once you reached the foundation of the wall, you excavated a large chamber beneath it. Pack the chamber with barrels of gunpowder. Light the fuse. Collapse the foundation and bring down the wall above. Simple in concept. Devastating in practice. Detection was the first challenge. Reinhardt had crews place water-filled bowls on floors throughout the city, especially near the walls. When enemy miners dug underground, the vibrations created ripples in the water. Observers watched these bowls constantly. On a quiet morning, ripples appeared in 3 bowls positioned near the northeastern bastion. Beck organized countermining teams. The theory was straightforward. Dig your own tunnel toward the enemy mine. Break through. Either collapse their tunnel or fight the miners underground and stop them manually. The reality was terrifying. Beck recruited miners from the city. Magdeburg was near silver mining territories, so some men had experience working underground. But mine warfare was different. You weren't digging for ore. You were digging toward people trying to kill you. The tunnels were barely 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. You crawled through absolute darkness, except for oil lamps that consumed precious oxygen. The air was thick, hot, difficult to breathe. Timber beams held back tons of earth that could collapse at any moment. And you worked knowing that enemy miners were somewhere ahead, digging toward you. Peter Meinhof volunteered for a countermining team. Beck tried to talk him out of it. You're a student, not a miner. This isn't your kind of work. Meinhof was adamant. Everyone else is doing work they weren't trained for. Why should I be different? He went down with a team of 5 men. They worked in shifts, digging through packed earth and stone with picks and shovels. Every few feet they placed the support beams. The only sounds were their breathing, the scrape of tools, and occasionally the distant thump of artillery above. Progress was measured in feet per day. After 3 days of digging, they broke through into the Imperial Tunnel. What happened next was combat in conditions almost impossible to describe. The tunnel was too narrow to swing a sword. Men fought with picks, shovels, knives, hands, in pitch darkness, breathing air thick with dust. Meinhof stabbed a man he couldn't see, felt the body go limp, kept stabbing until he was certain. The fighting lasted minutes, but felt like hours. The countermining team drove the Imperial sappers back. Then they packed the enemy tunnel with rubble and collapsed it using a small explosive charge. The blast shook buildings throughout the city. When Meinhof emerged from the tunnel, he was covered in mud and blood. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't hear properly. The explosion had temporarily deafened him. Anna Kessler found him sitting against a wall, staring at nothing. She brought water and sat beside him in silence. Some experiences were beyond words. Over the next 2 weeks, Imperial engineers attempted 4 more mining operations. Each time, Magdeburg's countermining teams detected and neutralized them. But the cost mounted. 18 miners killed, dozens injured. Gunpowder reserves dropped to critical levels because they needed explosives to collapse enemy tunnels. One mine succeeded. The Imperial sappers avoided detection by digging deeper than expected. On a morning in early May, they detonated their charge. The explosion was massive. A 30-foot section of the eastern wall collapsed in a cascade of stone and dust. A breach, finally. Pappenheim ordered immediate assault. If his troops could exploit the breach before defenders sealed it, the siege was over. Reinhardt mobilized everyone. Civilians rushed to fill the gap with anything available: rubble, timber, furniture, bodies of the dead. They built a makeshift barricade while Imperial forces organized their attack. The defense of the breach became the most desperate fighting of the siege. Hand-to-hand combat in the gap with no room for tactics, just survival. Beck fought beside Reinhardt, wielding a sword he hadn't touched in 15 years. Women threw burning oil from adjacent walls. Children hauled stones to defenders. The Imperial assault came in waves. Each wave was repulsed, but barely. By sunset, the breach still held. Imperial casualties approached 400. Magdeburg lost 67 killed and over 100 wounded. That night, Reinhardt sat in the rubble. He was 56 years old. Every muscle ached, his hands were cut and bleeding. But the walls still stood, barely. By early May, Klaus Reinhardt faced a reality he couldn't ignore. The mathematics of survival had turned against them. They'd started with 2,000 defenders. Casualties, disease, and exhaustion had reduced that number to roughly 1,300 able to fight. 400 killed, 300 too wounded to continue. The rest sick or dying. Food rations had been cut to near starvation levels. People were eating things they wouldn't have fed to animals 2 months ago. Moldy bread, leather boiled until it was soft enough to chew. Rats when they could catch them. Gunpowder reserves were nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were gone. Margareta Schultz was treating wounds with strips torn from clothing. She had no medicine, no anesthesia, nothing but water and prayer. Infections killed as many people as Imperial weapons. Disease was spreading through the crowded conditions. Dysentery hit first, moving through the population like invisible fire. People weakened by hunger had no resistance. 50 died in 2 weeks from sickness alone. The physical deterioration was matched by psychological strain. People who'd held strong for weeks were beginning to crack. Arguments erupted over food distribution. Some families were caught hoarding supplies. Trust, the foundation of their collective defense, was eroding. A faction formed advocating surrender. They had legitimate arguments. We've proven our courage. We've held longer than anyone expected. Now we should negotiate while we still have bargaining power. Save who we can. The Guild Council met in a basement room. The debate was heated. A merchant named Hoffman spoke for the surrender faction. We've lost half our people. The rest are starving. We have no ammunition, no medicine. Winter's coming. What exactly are we accomplishing by continuing? Reinhardt listened to the arguments. Part of him agreed. They'd fought well. Maybe it was enough. Maybe saving the survivors was the wise choice now. Anna Kessler spoke next. My husband died defending this city 15 years ago in a different war, she said. I stayed because Magdeburg is home. If we surrender, Pappenheim will execute the leaders. The rest will lose property, rights, probably their freedom. If we fight, we might still lose everything. But we'll lose on our terms. Thomas Werner stood. He was 14 years old, an orphan who'd volunteered as a messenger. He'd seen more death in 2 months than most people saw in a lifetime. I have nowhere else to go, he said quietly. This is my home too. I'll fight. The vote was called. Continue the defense or negotiate surrender. The result was closer than Reinhardt expected, but the decision held. They would fight. That night, he walked the walls alone. The city was burning in 3 places. Fires they no longer had enough people to fight. The eastern wall was a ruin, held together by rubble and desperation. Bodies were piled in the courtyards, waiting for burial they didn't have time to perform. He thought about his wife and daughter, both dead 7 years now. Sometimes he couldn't remember their faces clearly anymore. Peter Meinhof found him at dawn. The young student had aged a decade and 2 months. He walked with a limp from the mine fighting. His hands shook constantly. I have intelligence, he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. Pappenheim's supply convoy was delayed. His commanders were pressuring him for results. He needed victory before the summer campaign season, which meant another major assault was coming. Soon. How soon? Reinhardt asked. Days, maybe a week. Reinhardt did the calculation. They didn't have a week. They had maybe 3 days before starvation and disease reduced them below the minimum needed to defend the walls. The final council meeting happened that evening. Reinhardt laid out the truth without softening it. Pappenheim would launch a massive assault. If they survived it, they'd be too weak to survive the next one. If they surrendered first, they might negotiate better terms than they'd get after another battle. The silence was heavy. Anna Kessler broke it. I say we fight, not because we can win, because we've come this far, because those who died deserve to have their sacrifice mean something. The vote was unanimous this time. They would make their stand. Reinhardt spent the next 2 days preparing for the end. They stockpiled every remaining weapon, built internal barricades as fallback positions, moved the wounded to the deepest cellars. Peter Meinhof helped people write final letters. Many couldn't write, so he wrote for them. On May 19th, Pappenheim sent his final ultimatum: surrender by dawn or face total annihilation. Reinhardt's response was brief. We are citizens of Magdeburg. We will not surrender. If you want our city, come take it. May 20th dawned cold and gray. Klaus Reinhardt stood on what remained of the eastern wall, watching the Imperial army prepare. 25,000 men were, forming up for what everyone knew would be the final assault. The pre-dawn darkness was filled with the sounds of troops moving into position. Drums beating, officers shouting orders, the metallic scrape of thousands of men checking weapons. At 4 in the morning, every Imperial cannon fired simultaneously. The bombardment was unlike anything that had come before. Every gun in Pappenheim's arsenal unleashed at once. The noise was physical, a continuous roar that made thought impossible. Stone and dust filled the air. Buildings collapsed. Fires erupted throughout the city. For 3 hours, the cannons fired without pause. Walls that had held for 2 months crumbled. The southern bastion collapsed entirely. The eastern wall, already weakened, developed multiple breaches. By 7 o'clock, Magdeburg's defenses were ruins held together by determination alone. Then, the bombardment stopped. In the sudden silence, defenders heard the drums begin, then the assault horns, then the roar of 15,000 Imperial troops attacking from all sides simultaneously. Reinhardt watched them come. Endless columns of soldiers with scaling ladders, battering rams advancing on the gates, sappers running toward weak points with explosive charges. This was total war. Every defender was on the walls. Men, women, children, the elderly, the walking wounded, everyone who could hold a weapon. There were no reserves, no fallback positions. Hold or die. At Reinhardt's position on the eastern breach, Imperial infantry poured through the gap. He met them with a mason's hammer, the same tool he'd used to build these walls. Now he swung it at men trying to destroy what he'd created. The fighting was savage and chaotic, hand-to-hand combat in rubble with no room for tactics. Reinhardt lost track of time. He fought, swung, struck, moved to the next threat. Beside him, civilians he'd known for decades fought with the same desperate fury. At the western gate, Johann Beck led the defense against a battering ram. The gate splintered under repeated impacts. When it finally broke, Imperial cavalry charged through. Beck organized a countercharge. Civilians with pikes against armored horsemen. It was suicide, but it was necessary. If the cavalry got into the city streets, the defense would collapse. The charge succeeded through sheer desperation. The cavalry pulled back, leaving Beck severely wounded with a sword cut across his ribs. On the northern wall, Anna Kessler's position ran out of ammunition. The women resorted to throwing stones by hand. When Imperial troops reached the top of the wall, Kessler fought with a broken pike. A section was briefly overrun. Imperial soldiers secured a foothold on the battlements. Thomas Werner, the 14-year-old messenger, saw it happening. He rallied a group of children and teenagers with a simple message. Reinhardt needs help at the north wall. The counterattack came from people who should have been protected, not fighting. Children and elderly, armed with whatever they could grab. They retook the wall through numbers and absolute refusal to accept defeat. By mid-morning, the defense was collapsing. Imperial troops held positions inside the outer courtyards. Multiple breaches were open. Defenders were falling back to inner positions. Casualties were catastrophic. Peter Meinhof coordinated from a church tower. Despite his injuries, he watched the battle patterns, and he noticed something. The main Imperial push was a feint. The real attack was coming at the eastern bastion, the section they'd mined weeks ago. He ran to warn Reinhardt, got shot in the leg by an arrow, kept running. He reached Reinhardt. They're mining the bastion. Right now. It's about to blow. Reinhardt made a split-second decision. He ordered everyone off the bastion. 30 seconds later, the explosion destroyed the entire structure. A 30-foot section of wall collapsed in a massive cloud of dust and stone. The largest breach yet opened. Imperial troops poured through. This was where Magdeburg should have fallen. But the defenders didn't break. They fought building to building, street to street. Every house became a fortress, every doorway a choke point. The Imperial advance slowed to a crawl. By noon, Pappenheim faced his own crisis. His troops were exhausted. Casualties were enormous. The city was burning, but not surrendering. Officers reported that units couldn't maintain the assault. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Imperial trumpets sounded retreat. The silence after the retreat was worse than the battle. Klaus Reinhardt stood in rubble that had been the eastern wall, surrounded by dying defenders. His ears were ringing. His hands were covered in blood. He wasn't sure how much was his. Anna Kessler found him there. She was wounded, barely standing. A cut across her forehead bled into her eyes. "Are we dead yet?" she asked. "Not yet," Reinhardt replied. Around them, the city burned. Bodies lay everywhere. The wounded screamed for help that wasn't coming. Every building was damaged. Smoke filled the air. But they'd held. Against every tactical principle, every military calculation, they'd survived. Barely. Reinhardt tried to stand and fell. His leg wouldn't support his weight. He looked down and saw blood soaking through his trousers. He'd been wounded and hadn't noticed. Anna helped him to the makeshift hospital. Margareta Schultz was there, working on casualties with no supplies and no hope. She looked at Reinhardt's leg, then at his face. "You'll live," she said flatly. "Others won't. Let me get to them first." That afternoon brought a sound that no one expected. Strange noises from the Imperial camp. Not drums for another assault. Different rhythms. Movement that didn't match attack patterns. Peter Meinhof, still in the church tower despite his wounds, tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The Imperial forces were withdrawing, not regrouping for another assault. Actually withdrawing. He sent a message. "Down. Something's happening. They're pulling back." Scouts confirmed it over the next hours. The Imperial Army was breaking camp, destroying siege works they couldn't transport, loading wagons, preparing to march. But why? The answer came in pieces from multiple sources. Swedish forces under King Gustav Adolf had crossed into Brandenburg. 20,000 troops moving south. Expected to reach Magdeburg in 2 or 3 days. Pappenheim was facing potential encirclement. He couldn't take Magdeburg in 2 days. That morning had proven it. If he stayed, he'd be trapped between a fortified city and a Swedish field army. He'd made the rational decision: withdraw before the strategic situation became untenable. By evening, the Imperial camp was empty. The army that had besieged Magdeburg for 65 days was in full retreat south. The siege was over. There was no celebration, no cheering. The survivors were too exhausted, too traumatized. Most simply collapsed where they stood. Reinhardt sat on the cathedral steps that night, looking at his city. 40% of the buildings were destroyed. The walls were ruins. Mass graves would need to be dug for hundreds of dead. Of 2,000 original defenders, roughly 800 had survived. 600 killed in combat. 400 dead from disease and wounds. Hundreds more wounded, many permanently. He thought about the council meeting 2 months ago, when they'd voted to stay and fight, when he'd promised to defend the city. He'd kept that promise. But the cost was almost unbearable. Anna Kessler sat beside him in silence. Neither spoke. There were no words. 2 days later, Swedish relief forces arrived. The commander rode through the gates and stopped, surveying the destruction. He looked at Reinhardt. "How did you hold?" he asked. Reinhardt shook his head slowly. "I don't know." And he truly didn't. By every rational measure, they should have fallen in the first week. Professional soldiers with overwhelming numbers should have crushed civilian defenders. But something beyond military calculation had sustained them. Will, community, refusal to surrender, the simple human capacity to endure what seems unendurable. The Swedish commander offered assistance, medical supplies, food, engineers to help rebuild. Reinhardt accepted numbly. That night, he dreamed of his wife and daughter for the first time in years. In the dream, they were waiting for him in a house that wasn't burning. He tried to reach them, but couldn't. He woke before dawn, shaking. The siege was over, but for the survivors, it would never truly end. The weeks after the siege were grim work. Klaus Reinhardt returned to what he knew: building, or in this case, rebuilding. The walls needed immediate attention. Winter was coming, and gaping breaches would make the city indefensible if another threat emerged. But first, they buried the dead. 600 defenders killed in combat, 200 more dead from disease. The cathedral cemetery couldn't hold them all. Mass graves were dug outside the walls, simple wooden markers, no individual headstones, too many dead, too few survivors. Protestant rites were performed over hundreds of bodies at once. The pastor who conducted the service broke down halfway through. He'd known most of these people their entire lives. The wounded filled every available space. Margareta Schultz's hospital overflowed into adjacent buildings. 400 people required care. The Swedish relief forces brought medical supplies, but it was too late for many. Infections had set in during the siege. Without antibiotics, minor wounds became death sentences. Johann Beck lost his leg to gangrene. The Swedish surgeon amputated below the knee. Beck survived, but he'd never fight again. He returned to his brewery, working from a stool because standing exhausted him. Peter Meinhof's writings from this period show clear signs of trauma. Modern psychologists would recognize post-traumatic stress disorder. He described nightmares that persisted for years, flashbacks triggered by loud noises, an inability to feel safe even in peaceful surroundings. He wrote compulsively about the siege, as if documenting it might help him process what had happened. His chronicle became the primary historical source for events. But writing it cost him. Each page reopened wounds that never fully healed. Anna Kessler survived physically unscathed, relatively. Psychologically, she was shattered. She wrote letters to families of the dead, taking responsibility, blaming herself for convincing people to stay and fight. Many letters went unanswered. The families were dead too. She never fully recovered. Friends reported that she would sometimes stop mid-conversation, staring at nothing, lost in memories of the walls, the fighting, the bodies. Thomas Werner, 14 when the siege started, was 15 now. Orphaned before the siege, even more alone after. The Swedish army recruited him as a messenger. He spent the rest of the 30 Years' War in military service. He died at 22 during the Battle of Nördlingen, a minor skirmish in a war that dragged on for another 17 years. Just another casualty in a conflict that consumed a generation. Klaus Reinhardt returned to masonry. Over the next 5 years, he supervised reconstruction of the walls he defended. He preferred building to destroying, he said. The physical labor helped. It gave him something to focus on beyond the memories. But he never fully processed what happened. How could he? He'd led 2,000 civilians into a siege that killed more than half of them. Yes, they'd held. Yes, they'd achieved something remarkable. But 1,200 people had died under his command. That weight never lifted. He died in 1642, age 57. The official cause was fever, but people who knew him said he'd been dying slowly since the siege ended. Something inside him had broken during those 65 days. The strategic impact of Magdeburg's stand became clear over the following months. The city's resistance had delayed the imperial advance by nearly 3 months. That delay gave Sweden time to mobilize forces and enter the war decisively. The momentum of the 30 Years' War shifted. The Protestant cause, which had seemed doomed in early 1631, survived. Pappenheim's failure damaged his reputation. He'd thrown overwhelming force at a civilian garrison and been forced to retreat. His superiors questioned his judgment. His troops questioned his invincibility. Imperial casualties were estimated between 5,000 and 7,000 killed or wounded. For a professional army, those losses were significant, but not crippling. What hurt was the psychological impact. They'd been defeated by bakers and blacksmiths. In June, 800 survivors gathered in the ruined cathedral, a memorial service for the dead. No triumphalism, just gratitude for survival and mourning for those who hadn't made it. Reinhardt spoke briefly. "We didn't win," he said. "We survived. Our friends, families, neighbors didn't. We owe them memory. We owe them the city they died for. We rebuild." And they did. Slowly, painfully. Magdeburg rose from its ruins over the next decade. The years after the siege saw Magdeburg slowly rebuild. Swedish forces established a permanent garrison. The city remained a Protestant stronghold throughout the rest of the 30 Years' War. It was never besieged again, though the war continued ravaging Germany for another 17 years. The story of the siege spread across Europe. Within weeks, reports reached Vienna, Prague, Rome. The details varied, some exaggerated, some understated. But the core narrative remained consistent. A city of civilians had withstood a professional army for 65 days. The impossible had happened. For Protestant communities across Germany, the tale provided desperately needed hope. For years, they'd watched Ottoman and imperial forces advance seemingly without limit. Cities fell. Populations were displaced. The Protestant cause appeared doomed. Magdeburg proved resistance was possible. The propaganda value was enormous. Pamphlets circulated describing the siege. Artists created woodcuts showing civilians defending walls. Preachers invoked Magdeburg in sermons about faith and courage. Some accounts were accurate, many weren't. The legend grew larger than the reality, which often happens with stories that people need to believe. Klaus Reinhardt was hailed as a hero throughout the Protestant world. He reportedly found the attention uncomfortable. When asked about his leadership, he deflected credit to the defenders. "I did what was necessary," he said. "The people of Magdeburg did the rest." The women defenders became symbols of resistance. Anna Kessler and others were celebrated in chronicles and poems. Later generations remembered them as the firewomen of Magdeburg, civilians who'd taken up arms to defend their homeland. But there's an aspect of the siege that was largely forgotten. Unlike famous battles, no paintings were commissioned, no monuments erected. Most defenders didn't survive to tell their stories. Those who did often didn't want to remember. Peter Meinhof's chronicle, the most detailed eyewitness account, was filed in an archive and forgotten for 2 centuries. It wasn't until the 19th century that historians rediscovered it and realized the significance of what had happened. Modern military historians recognize Magdeburg as a crucial turning point, not just strategically, but conceptually. The siege demonstrated that professional military power had limits, that civilians, properly led and motivated, could mount effective defense. Military academies studied Reinhardt's tactics for decades. The earthwork reinforcements that absorbed artillery impact, the psychological warfare that made Pappenheim cautious, the integration of civilian defenders into a cohesive fighting force. These became case studies in defensive siege warfare. But the more important lesson wasn't tactical. It was about human capacity, what people can endure when they decide something is worth defending, the power of community over individual survival. 2,000 people had faced a choice: run to safety or stand and fight for home. Most chose to stand. 1,200 died, 800 lived. Was it worth it? That's a question without easy answers. The survivors wrestled with it for the rest of their lives. Reinhardt questioned his decision to fight until the day he died. Anna Kessler carried guilt over the deaths of people she'd convinced to stay. But their stand had consequences beyond Magdeburg. It bought time for Sweden to mobilize. It shifted momentum in a war that had seemed decided. It proved that ordinary people could resist extraordinary power. The 30 Years' War finally ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. Germany was devastated. An estimated 8 million people had died. Entire regions were depopulated. Magdeburg survived, damaged but standing. The city rebuilt over the following decades. The walls were strengthened. The population slowly recovered. Life continued, though different than before. Today, Magdeburg is a city of 250,000 people. The old fortifications are mostly gone, replaced by modern development. But remnants remain. Sections of wall, bastions, reminders of what happened there. A small museum documents the siege. Visitors can see artifacts, read accounts, walk the approximate positions where Klaus Reinhardt and his civilians stood against an empire. Few people outside Germany know the story. It's not taught in most history classes. It doesn't have the fame of major battles or dramatic last stands. But it deserves to be remembered, not for military glory, for what it says about ordinary people in impossible situations, about the choice to stand when running is easier, about community over individual survival. What makes Magdeburg significant isn't just the military outcome. It's what the siege represented. Ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, choosing to stand and fight rather than flee or surrender. The defenders weren't elite soldiers. They were merchants, craftsmen, widows, students. People who'd never held weapons before the siege. Children who carried messages because there was nothing else they could do. They didn't fight for conquest or glory. They fought because the alternative was unacceptable. Submission meant losing everything: their homes, their rights, their way of life. Some things, they decided, were worth defending even when the odds made victory impossible. History tends to remember famous battles, brilliant generals, decisive victories. But sometimes, the most important moments are quieter. A city that refused to fall. Citizens who became soldiers. Ordinary people who proved that courage and community can overcome impossible odds. Leadership mattered at Magdeburg. Klaus Reinhardt wasn't a military genius. He was a mason who understood structures and knew how to organize people. He prepared his garrison. He made rational decisions under pressure. He trusted people to rise to challenges. Most importantly, he stayed. When the city council fled, when professional soldiers withdrew, when every rational person left for safety, Reinhardt stayed. That decision, more than any tactical brilliance, defined the siege. Leadership in crisis isn't about grand gestures. It's about preparation, clear communication, and believing people are capable of more than they think they are. The women of Magdeburg demonstrated something that military establishments of the time refused to acknowledge: Gender didn't determine capability under fire. Anna Kessler and hundreds of others fought as effectively as any soldier. They killed enemy troops, defended positions, and refused to break. Their combat role was largely ignored by contemporary accounts. Male chroniclers either downplayed it or didn't mention it at all. Modern historians, looking at primary sources more carefully, recognize the significance. Women didn't ask permission to fight. They just fought. The siege also offers lessons about the limits of military power. The imperial forces had every advantage: numbers, training, equipment, experience. By every tactical calculation, they should have won in the first week. But wars aren't fought on spreadsheets. Morale matters, will matters. The Imperials could bombard Magdeburg, mine it, assault it repeatedly. But they couldn't break the will of people defending their home. That made all the difference. There's a question worth considering. If you were in Magdeburg in early 1631, knowing what was coming, would you have stayed? Would you have fought? There's no right answer. It's easy to admire heroism from 400 years away. It's much harder to choose it when your life is on the line. 2,000 people made that choice. 800 lived. 1,200 died. They held a city that shouldn't have held. They defeated an army that had never been defeated, not through military genius, through refusal to surrender. If this story resonated with you, share it. Leave a comment about what stood out. Subscribe if you want more forgotten history. History remembers those who stand when standing seems futile. The defenders of Magdeburg stood. 4 centuries later, we're still telling their story. That's legacy. The siege of Magdeburg wasn't just a battle. It was a statement that freedom is worth defending, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, that the human spirit, when pushed to its limit, is more powerful than any army. In 1631, on the banks of the Elbe River, 2,000 souls proved that truth. For 65 days, they held. And the world, even if it took us 400 years, remembered.